Okay, no worries. If you haven't gone through the handouts, not a problem. Obviously, at some stage, you would need to, look at going through them because they'll be useful for you to understand the details. Obviously, covering them through a video and a few slides might not be, entirely beneficial. But what we will have to do is at some stage, you will have to go in and obviously look at, the handouts which are there upon Moodle. So what we did yesterday was we basically looked at starting this particular unit in which we were looking at discussing, aspects of human physiology, just to do a quick recap. And then there are only 2 learning outcomes, but the learning outcomes are quite well loaded in the sense there's lots to cover in the first learning outcome itself. Out of the lots, let me put it this way, there are lots of different organs and organ systems in human body, and out of which we are looking at studying the 6 important ones in this particular unit, which is aspects of human physiology. So these 6 that we are going to look at in particular are going to be, the nervous system. We're going to be looking at, let me just quickly open Moodle as well, so I can show them to you just in case for those who were not present yesterday. So these 6 systems that we are looking at in particular, are going to be looking at the nervous system. We are looking at the cardiovascular system, digestive system. We are looking at studying the respiratory system, the endocrine system, and the excretory system. Now, we looked at yesterday's discussion. We focused on, understanding what are the level of organization that we get to see when we talk about cells, or start with atom, molecules, cell, then go to tissue, then organ, and then finally a number of organs come together to work in unison to create what is called an organ system. So we looked at, the nervous system. There are 2 aspects of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And obviously, this is what is depicted on the diagram. We looked at a 9-minute video which talks about, the various key components of the nervous system. And that helped us understand and get an overview of the human nervous system in particular. Then we went to the digestive system. We looked at what are the parts and organs which essentially comprise of the digestive system. There are 10 organs in total, which comprise of the digestive system, how the food gets, swallowed from the mouth using the process of peristalsis, mucus getting mixed, saliva getting mixed. It becomes a mucus solid. Then it reaches stomach. Once it reaches stomach, there is secretions of liver, bile, which is liver secretes bile juice, which is, then we had pancreatic juice and the other chemical formulas or, chemicals which get released, which help the food to be broken down into smaller nutrients meaning carbohydrate, proteins, and then the process of absorption of that starts in the small intestine, finally into the large intestine, which is where we, even essential ingredients like water, and other bits get absorbed into the blood. And then the waste is actually excreted out through the combination of rectum and anus in terms of, again, a process which basically involves contraction of muscles and peristalsis. Now, today we are going to be looking at, and then we looked at this video of digestive system, which was about a 4 or 5 minute video talking about the various ways in which food is eaten and how it gets digested. And it is one of the most important systems in the body because pretty much it is, along with the nervous system, this is present pretty much throughout or major parts of the human body in any case, and includes, kidneys, liver, pancreas, gallbladder, intestines, rectum and anus, and along with that, mouth and the esophagus. Now, today, what we are looking at doing is focusing on, what is cardiovascular system. So when we talk about, the cardiovascular system in particular, we are looking at, a system which basically, talks and looks at, when we talk about cardio means, heart or the cavity within your chest. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system, this is also known as sometimes circulatory system. And again, it's a complex network of, veins and nerves and some organs, which include, the heart in particular. And then this system in general, when we look at heart, vein, veins, arteries, and capillaries, which are fine endings of veins which go into, I gave an example yesterday. If you put your hand over fire, or if you prick yourself in the finger, these are basically nerve endings. Or if your finger comes in between, some sort of a hard object, then it feels a bit sore. And this is because the nerve endings or capillaries are able to pick up sensation, which is passing it to your brain. And that is where you feel that, okay, you had a bit of an injury, or you've had a bit of a cut or a bruise. So the cardiovascular system, which is also known as the circulatory system, is a complex network of, veins, arteries, and capillaries, together with the heart, which is responsible for pumping blood. And pumping of blood means that this is the system which is responsible for circulation of oxygen within the body, because the red blood cells, as you know, carry oxygen, and the exchange of oxygen with carbon dioxide happens in our lungs through the alveoli. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system, this system allows and basically looks at carrying waste products like carbon dioxide, which is where, cells in the body, the mitochondria, the powerhouse of your cells, which is basically creating amino acids, or it is basically excreting, it is basically creating energy by burning food or nutrients. And then the byproduct of that tends to be carbon dioxide. And those are then excreted through the, through the blood, gets purified in the lungs, and then circulation back into the body. And that typically happens through the process of, the organs which are part and parcel of the cardiovascular system. So cardiovascular system is very crucial, because if the heart stops pumping blood, then at some stage you will, not be able to survive, because if oxygen doesn't reach your brain or certain vital organs, then they start to fail, and multiple organ failure then leads to finally, some sort of, the person slipping away, or basically person dying. So when we talk about the cardiovascular system in general, what should come to your mind is that you should think of heart, you should think of arteries, veins. Arteries carry fresh blood, veins carry, impure blood, where back to the lungs, wherein through the alveoli, the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens, and the pure blood then flows through, and that blood basically goes into the heart, and from the heart, it pumps it out to the arteries. And when we talk about, the medium through which this exchange happens, is the key component, or the transport medium is primarily blood, which carries oxygen from the lungs to the body tissue, and carbon dioxide, from the tissues back to the lung. And that is where it is excreted out through your nasal pathways, or, through your nose or your mouth. And the blood also then, in the essence, also tends to do a double function, which is it also provides nutrients, or delivers nutrients to essential parts of the body and other various organs, because all the nutrients or essential bits which are required to produce energy are typically absorbed through the process of homeostasis. We will discuss this in learning outcome 2, and that allows the nutrients to be absorbed. But it is the blood, it's like a river. It's like a river, but the river is basically the blood, which basically carries oxygen and these nutrients. And in particular, when we look at blood is made up of, which I mentioned earlier in another session, that when we look at our blood, it is made up of 3 different types of cells: red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and obviously plasma, which is the fluid, mucus fluid, which is basically, giving it the flow, in terms, that is why it is able to flow. Now, when we talk about blood and why is it red in color, is because of the red blood cells, and it carries oxygen, and that is where the oxygenation of the blood happens with the iron, ferrous oxide kind of thing, and that is why the color of the blood in mammals is generally red. And when you look at pure blood, which is in this diagram, as you can see, is being shown that it is being pumped from the heart, and that is being carried through the arteries. Impure blood, which is carrying carbon dioxide and nutrients which are to be exchanged in the lungs, are normally also carried, they are carried back into the heart or the chamber of lungs, and then it is pumped into the heart, is generally done through veins. So veins tend to carry impure blood, and arteries tend to carry pure blood. And this cardiovascular system is very vital in maintaining life and health of any tissue and any organ in our body is because of the fact that this is the medium through which nutrients are essentially delivered to the to any sort of organ, tissue, cell within the body. So we have also heard sometimes and seen in the news that the people who smoke a lot or people who do excessive drinking can face what are called cardiovascular diseases, and one such type of diseases tends to be blocking of your arteries in the heart or high cholesterol, and that leads to at some stage angina, which is basically pain in your heart. And then at some stage, if it leads to blockages within your blockages are nothing but when blood flow is interrupted in the heart, you will generally have what is called angina, which is pain. And that persistent pain and the blockage can finally lead to some sort of a heart attack. That means blockage of blood, blockage of the flow of blood, and that causes a block in the heart, and in some cases a clot, and that leads to what is called a heart attack. That is why cardiovascular system is very, very important. Now, in order to pictorially see this in terms of how this works in the human body, I think the best way to look at this is to look at a short video of what is cardiovascular system. So what I'll do is basically share a screen for a particular video that I'm going to play, and that would allow you to see how the cardiovascular system actually works. So let's listen in and see this particular video.
Circulatory system that circulates blood. The circulatory system also includes the lymphatic system, which circulates lymph. But the terms circulatory system and cardiovascular system are commonly used interchangeably to describe blood circulation. The cardiovascular system consists of the heart, blood, and blood vessels. The heart is essentially a pump that moves blood through the vessels. It has two sides, each of which has two chambers. The best known function of the circulatory system is perhaps the transport of inhaled oxygen from the lungs to body's tissues and removal of carbon dioxide in the opposite direction to be exhaled. Basically, oxygen-poor blood from the body returns to the right side of the heart, where it is pumped to the lungs. In the lungs, blood picks up oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. Oxygen-rich blood then returns to the left side of the heart. This part of the system is called the pulmonary circuit. The left side of the heart pumps oxygen-rich blood to body's tissues, where it unloads oxygen and picks up carbon dioxide. The resulting deoxygenated returns to the heart's right side to complete the cycle. This part is the systemic circuit. Because the heart's left side has to pump blood to the entire body, it has much thicker muscle than the right side. There are 4 valves which serve to ensure one-way blood flow through the heart. Oxygen-poor blood flows from right atrium to right ventricle to pulmonary arteries, while oxygen-rich blood moves from left atrium to left ventricle to the aorta. The heart is enclosed in a double-walled protective sac called the pericardium. The pericardial cavity contains a fluid which serves as lubricant and allows the heart to contract and relax with minimum friction. The heart wall has 3 layers. The outer layer, epicardium, lines the pericardial cavity. The inner layer, endocardium, lines heart chambers and valves and is continuous with the endothelium of blood vessels. And the thick middle layer, myocardium, is the muscle tissue responsible for the beating of the heart. The contraction of the heart muscle is initiated by electrical impulses, known as action potentials. Unlike skeletal muscles, which have to be stimulated by the nervous system, the heart generates its own electrical stimulation. The impulses start from a small group of cells called the pacemaker cells, which constitute the cardiac conduction system. The primary pacemaker is the SA node. It initiates all heartbeats and controls heart rate. Apart from transporting gases, the blood also supplies body's tissues with nutrients and removes metabolic wastes. It receives nutrients from the digestive system, where digested substances are absorbed through the walls of the small intestine into the bloodstream. These substances are then passed through the liver to be screened for toxins before joining the general circulation. In tissues, nutrients are exchanged for wastes. Wastes are then filtered from the blood in the kidneys and removed in urine. The blood also carries hormones from endocrine glands to target organs and plays an important role in the body's immune defense. The blood has two main components, a clear extracellular fluid called plasma, and the so-called formed elements, which include red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells transport oxygen and carbon dioxide. White blood cells participate in various defense mechanisms against invading organisms, while the platelets are responsible for blood clotting, minimizing blood loss during an injury. The blood circulatory system is a closed loop, meaning the blood itself never leaves the vessels. Instead, substances diffuse through the walls of blood vessels to move to and from the surrounding tissues. Vessels that move blood away from the heart are called arteries, while those that bring blood back to the heart are veins. Arteries usually carry oxygenated blood, while veins carry deoxygenated blood. For pulmonary...
So one of the key things that I mentioned here was that when you look at arteries carry pure blood, which means medical term oxygenated blood. And the other thing which you notice in the video is that the arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry impure blood or deoxygenated blood. That means there is less oxygen and more carbon dioxide in that part, and they bring blood back to the lungs and heart for the purposes of purification. So this is an important point.
Arteries and veins, however, the reverse is true. The usual route of blood flow is heart to large arteries, smaller arteries, then even smaller arteries called arterioles, then smallest blood vessels called capillaries, where the exchange of substances takes place. Blood then collects into small veins called venules, then to larger veins, and back to the heart. Arteries and veins essentially serve to conduct blood. Their walls consist of 3 layers. An outer layer of loose connective tissue serves to anchor the vessels to the surroundings. A middle layer of mostly smooth muscles allows the vessels to constrict or dilate, regulating blood flow. And an inner layer consisted of thin squamous endothelium, separated from outer layers by a basement membrane. In general, larger vessels have more connective tissue and smooth muscle. In addition, arteries have more muscles than veins because they carry blood away from the heart and must withstand higher pressures generated by the beating of the heart. The walls of capillaries, whose function is to exchange substances between the blood and surrounding tissue, consist solely of a thin endothelium with its basement membrane, thus permitting easy diffusion of blood solutes.
As you can see, in terms of this particular video, it just gives you, I would say, an overview of how the cardiovascular system actually works. Now, there is one bit which was mentioned in this, is that when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we also saw that this term of cardiovascular system is used interchangeably as circulatory system, simply because of the fact that it is, it basically is revolving around the fact that it circulates blood in the body. And then the absorption of nutrients from the blood vessels typically happens at the smallest version of the veins and arterioles, and they tend to be what are called capillaries, wherein the process of homeostasis or diffusion in a way tends to happen, wherein the material or the nutrients actually get absorbed into the bloodstream and from there into the tissue layers. Now, there is a handout which is there on Moodle, which is a good handout for you to read about the cardiovascular system. in addition to what you see as a video, I would definitely suggest that you need to look at this particular handout, which is the cardiovascular system given here, to be able to read into it. And again, this is an extract from a book because this is a chapter on cardiovascular system, and it provides all the details that we need to know in terms of what are the organs which comprise of cardiovascular system, the breakdown of arteries to arterioles, vessels to veins to venules, capillaries, and some of the medical terms and key medical terms that we use when we discuss about the structure and the schematics of the cardiovascular system. So I would suggest that you read this particular handout, which will help you crystallize and understand the organs and their role and what is their role in the cardiovascular system. So this particular handout is about 47 pages, give or take, with some activities in the middle to test your knowledge as well. But it is a good 2.5 hour read if you read it thoroughly. And for those of you who understand the terminology, for you, it would mean a case of just doing a casual reading, but maybe reading with a bit of I would say, attention would help you also retain some of the key aspects that we need to be looking at covering and understanding in the cardiovascular system. Now, this would also have things like when we look at diagnostic procedures, things like when you have an electrocardiogram, this is ECG, you have an echocardiogram. When we test the strength at which the heart beats, we look at angioplasty when a stenting has to be done to remove a blockage. What is a catheter? There are terms which typically would be used when you are in the nursing profession, and sometimes you look at cannula, you look at catheter, you look at different types of pipes which are used, or test tubes and syringes and other bits. So you'll get to read some of these bits which are used in the cardiovascular system, or at least when you're treating patients, and they would also be available in this particular handout. Now, the next system that we want to look at, any questions on this? What we've covered, cardiovascular system, any questions? Right. So if we now move to the respiratory system. Now, what is respiratory system? Respiratory system is a biological system or one of the other, organ systems in the human body, which is structured in a way which allows the exchange of gases within our body. When I say exchange of gases, what it means is the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen. The breathing part of it that we discuss, typically is what is, involved in the respiratory system. So when we talk about mammals in particular and in particular humans, the anatomy of respiratory system, consists of different organs. Now, as we looked at the digestive system, the nervous system, the cardiovascular system, there are different organs which function to make this a system as a whole when we say a respiratory system. So it starts with the nose and nasal cavity. So through the nose, we breathe in and breathe out. There is a mucus lining our nose, and that when you breathe in actually moistens the air or softens the not softens, I'll put it this way, it basically warms the air going into the body. And this part through which we inhale and exhale oxygen or air, essentially when we are breathing, as I'm talking right now, I'm breathing. So for example, I am basically using my nose and my nasal cavity to be able to allow air to enter into the respiratory system. And the nasal cavities typically, when we talk about the nose, the concha and the vestibule, which is the tissue which is host, and the structure which is actually holding or shaping the nose, is an important part because the nasal cavity actually warms, it moistens, and it also filters the air, removing particulate matter or pathogens when we breathe air into our lungs through the nasal cavity. So sometimes as kids, we've been asked to blow our nose and things like that, is because that over a point in time, if you're playing in dusty environment, or if you're, obviously in a humid environment or a tropical climate, sometimes you would see that the nasal cavity plays a very important part, because one, it removes particulate matter, and it also gets rid of pathogen which gets stuck, which are basically bigger say organisms which are trying to enter the human body through the respiratory route, and the nasal cavity looks at blocking it, or essentially filtering it out. Then the second part that we talk about is pharynx, which is basically your windpipe. So when we talk about pharynx in general, we also call it the throat. And here it serves as a passageway for both, not just air, but also food. So when we talk about pharynx, it is basically the neck or the cavity. But when we talk about windpipe and we talk about esophagus, they tend to differentiate where your food goes, which goes into the esophagus. And when we talk about the windpipe, that tends to be the trachea, because that is where your air actually enters into the or takes them into the lungs. Pharynx then leads to also called larynx. Larynx basically is the voice box. The way I'm speaking, the way I sound, the tone is basically coming from the voice box. Larynx, in short, is also called the voice box, which is located underneath the pharynx. So it is like a palate, which basically allows you to speak. So sometimes when your vocal cords are swollen, or you have mumps, essentially you would, or tonsils, your which are openings towards the back of your mouth, and they get swollen, you're not unable to speak. When it gets infected, or you have, say, for example, you get viral infection, then sometimes your larynx swells up, and that means that you're unable to speak, because of the fact that the voice box is not working properly, because it has been infected and it is swollen up. And that is the reason why sometimes we lose our voice, and we have strepsils, or some sort of the lozenges to basically soothe the larynx or our voice box. Now, the larynx is playing a very important part, is because it protects the trachea, which is your windpipe, and it does not allow any solid food or any sort of mucus to enter the windpipe. Because if it enters, sometimes when we are eating and talking, and our parents always teach us that don't talk while you're eating, because sometimes the food gets into the windpipe, and that is where you choke, you cough, and that is to bring that out, or to basically clear the passage. And this basically consists of three different different types of tissues. One is the epiglottis, which is primarily the tissue which stops anything entering into the trachea. You have the thyroid cartilage. So thyroid is another gland which is present. And then the cricoid cartilage, which is present primarily in the larynx. So it is made up of three different types of, tissues or cartilages. Under the larynx, you have a trachea, which is the windpipe, essentially, which is shown here. Now, this is basically a conduit. Let's put it this way. It is like a connection between your lungs and your mouth, which basically allows, when I say mouth, or your nasal cavity in particular, which allows the air allows the air to go into your lungs. Now, within the lungs, we have bronchi and we have bronchioles. So bronchi is a plural part, which is basically larger cells which are present, which further divide into what are called bronchioles. And that is where the network of these bronchioles essentially is the place where the exchange of air, oxygen with carbon dioxide happens in the blood. Then the main part of the respiratory system, which forms a massive part of your respiratory system, is your lungs. So bronchi and bronchioles are branching network of veins and capillaries, which basically, allow for the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide to happen in the blood, in the lungs. And lungs are the main respiratory system where the exchange of these gases actually happens. So each lung is composed of, what are called lobes. So we have two lungs, two lobes, left lobe and the right lobe, and they have millions of alveoli. which is basically, so when we talk about alveoli, what we mean by alveoli is that these are the, if I show you some sort of, for example, an image, these are basically tiny air sacs, which are present in lungs, which is where, the breathing process, or exchange of oxygen in the blood with the carbon dioxide actually happens. So when we talk about alveoli, they are basically tiny air sacs that are present in lungs. It's a branching network of these air sacs which allow and help in the exchange of gases between the lungs and the bloodstream. Now, they are responsible for also facilitating the diffusion of oxygen from the air that we breathe in, because when we breathe in the air, it's a combination of air, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. If you're, standing under a tree, or, if you're standing next to a passing vehicle, there are lots of different types of, particles that you inhale in the air. But the main part of the exchange which is required to happen within the lungs is basically oxygen. So when we breathe the air into our through our nasal cavity into the trachea and into the lungs, the exchange primarily happens between what we are breathing in is oxygen being taken out from that air, and then the carbon dioxide being absorbed and then excreted out again back from the nasal capacity. Now, this basic interchange of gaseous exchange, if I would put it this way, happens in what is called the bronchi and bronchioles. Now, each alveoli is a plural. Alveoli, when I say alveoli, which is a plural, and singular is alveolus. So each alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries, which are basically very fine, the meshwork that you see here, very fine, thin, blood vessels that help in the facilitation of exchange of these gases. And the alveoli, as I mentioned to you, is basically air sacs, or in general, the medical term is, alveoli, the literal term is airbags or air sacs essentially. And when we breathe in and exhale here, these alveoli actually contract. So these air sacs contract and expand, and they push air, inhale. When we inhale, they bring air in, and when we exhale, they bring or push air out of the lungs. Now let's look at a video to basically understand this pictorially. So let me play that video, and I'll share that screen so that you're able to see this pictorially in terms of what is respiratory system.
£6,000. Can't afford to read.
We've gone through many of the important systems of the human body, but the one that we are possibly most acutely aware of at all times is the respiratory system. Every couple of seconds, we breathe in air from the atmosphere and then breathe out. This is to supply every cell in our bodies with one particular component of the atmosphere, oxygen. Our cells need oxygen to perform cellular respiration, which generates the energy we use to think and move around. Without oxygen, we can't produce energy, and we don't last very long. So how exactly does the respiratory system work? Let's take a closer look now. As we said, the major function of the respiratory system is to supply every nook and cranny of the body with oxygen, and it also serves to collect carbon dioxide, a byproduct of cellular respiration, and expunge it from the body when we exhale. We already learned about part of this process when we talked about the circulatory system. There, we learned about how oxygen can bind to hemoglobin and travel through the bloodstream, diffusing into tissue at capillary beds. But we also have to learn about how oxygen gets into the bloodstream in the first place. And for that, we need to understand pulmonary ventilation, also called breathing, whereby oxygen enters the lungs from our surroundings, as well as external respiration, which is how oxygen gets from the lungs to the blood, and how carbon dioxide gets from the blood to the lungs. To understand this, let's take a look at this system as a whole. The respiratory system includes the nose, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs, which contain little sacs called alveoli. All of these components belong to one of two zones. There is the respiratory zone, which is where gas is exchanged within the lungs, and the conducting zone, which is all the rest, where air comes in and out of the body. Starting with the nose, we probably know that air enters through the nostrils, and since we've already touched on other structural aspects of the nose earlier in the series, we will jump straight to the nasal cavity. This is separated from the oral cavity by the palate, which has two sections, the bony hard palate and the muscular soft palate. We can also see the nasal vestibule with hairs for filtering, as well as three nasal conchi, which are mucosa-covered projections, separated by nasal meatuses. These serve to filter, heat, and moisten the air. The nasal cavity is surrounded by the paranasal sinuses, which produce mucus that flows into the nasal cavity. Next, we see the pharynx, or throat. This connects the nasal cavity with the mouth. This has three regions, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. This passageway continues down into the esophagus when eating food, but as far as air goes, the next stop is the larynx, or voice box. This provides an airway and also serves as the site of voice production. The larynx is comprised of a variety of cartilages, including the epiglottis, which stays open for airflow, but when swallowing, it will cover up the laryngeal inlet so that we don't end up breathing our food. Then we see the vocal folds and vestibular folds, which are the true vocal cords and false vocal cords, respectively. More on these structures another time. Next, we find the trachea, or windpipe, which descends and divides into two main or primary bronchi, one to the right and one to the left. Each bronchus will quickly subdivide into lobar or secondary bronchi, which in turn branch into segmental or tertiary bronchi, and this continues even further until we get to passageways less than a millimeter in diameter, which are called bronchioles. As these tubes get smaller, the epithelium gets thinner, the amount of cartilage decreases, and the amount of smooth muscle increases. This ends at the terminal bronchioles, which feed into the respiratory bronchioles, and this marks the boundary between the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The respiratory bronchioles have structures that protrude called alveoli, which are collected in alveolar sacs, like grapes in a bunch. Because of the extensive branching in the bronchi, this results in hundreds of millions of alveoli, and this is where gas exchange takes place. These structures have very thin walls made of a single layer of squamous epithelial cells, which is what allows for the diffusion of gases, and they are covered by a cobweb of pulmonary capillaries. So blood vessels are right up against the alveoli, ready to make a trade. The air in the sacs has plenty of oxygen and the blood doesn't, so diffusion occurs spontaneously, and the blood has a good amount of carbon dioxide, and that will diffuse in the opposite direction so that it can be exhaled.
What if you could do yoga with an Indian yoga teacher, live?
So you're able to understand this in terms of, obviously it's an 8-minute video, but the video explains the respiratory system in a bit more detail, which I've explained verbally.
Structure. These cone-shaped organs occupy almost all of the thoracic cavity, and they are surrounded by the visceral pleura and parietal pleura, while lying in close contact with the ribs from the apex down to the base. The hilum is where blood vessels and nerves enter and leave the lungs, and the cardiac notch is a small cavity in the left lung that accommodates the heart. We can see different fissures in each lung that divide them into different lobes, with 2 fissures and 3 lobes in the right lung, and 1 fissure and 2 lobes for the left.
That is where the
Lung
heart
tissue
is.
itself is called stroma, which is made of elastic connective tissue. When we looked at the circulatory system, we mentioned the pulmonary arteries and veins that bring blood to and from the lungs, arriving oxygen poor and leaving oxygen rich. So we can imagine those connecting to the pulmonary capillaries to complete the circuit. Within the lungs, there is the intrapulmonary pressure, or the pressure in the alveoli, and the intrapleural pressure, the pressure in the pleural cavity that sits between the two pleurae. The intrapleural pressure is negative, which is what keeps the lungs open. Ventilation, or breathing, is the result of the activity of inspiratory muscles, namely the diaphragm and intercostal muscles, which produces a change in volume and thereby a change in pressure, allowing air to enter along the pressure gradient. As they relax, expiration occurs. In between, oxygen diffuses and binds to hemoglobin present in the blood so that it can then be transported to tissues all around the body. And with that, we have a basic understanding of the respiratory system, and combining this with previous knowledge of the circulatory system, we have a clear picture of how oxygen enters the body and gets to where it needs to go. Let's continue.
So with this particular slide, I put across into the references list as well, because this particular channel, and the videos by Professor Dave actually explain all the different types of systems. So the videos are quite informative, and this is something that you can look at in a bit more detail should you wish to look at videos of all the systems, from his particular channel. Now, let's go across. Any questions on this so far? Let's go across to the next system that we want to understand, which is the excretory system. Now, excretory system is also a very important system in the body because it removes the excess and the unnecessary or waste material from our body. And this system, is vitally important to understand, because this is where the process of homeostasis takes place, because it helps regulate body temperature, your pH level, your sodium level, your electrolytes, and your potassium level in the body. And the working of this system is very important because this is related to or has organs like kidneys, your bladder, your urethra, your liver, your lungs. Sometimes are also classed as a part of this particular system if we include the breathing part of it. But generally speaking, liver, your skin, your urethra, your bladder, your kidneys are a part which are organs essentially, which make this system. Now, the reason why this is important, and when we look at the primary organs, you have the kidney. There are two kidneys in the human body. There is one liver. You look at bladder, which is where basically your urine or your fluids are stored when it has to be excreted out, from urethra and through the route of anus. And when we look at the liver, which produces bile and some of the important juices which help in the digestion or breaking down of nutrients or food that we eat into smaller particles like molecules, vitamins, carbohydrates, which are then absorbed into your bloodstream through the tissue layers. And then we also look at skin, which is a part of this system, is because when we sweat, we also looked at in the other video which was playing before the respiratory system, we also looked at what is called the endocrine system. And that system basically, is a combination of veins or nerves which basically help the body sweat, and they end into the skin. So when we talk about skin also helps us excrete waste. How does it help us excrete waste? Normally in the form of sweat. And this, process of sweating, wherein the skin eliminates excess water, salts, and also small amounts of urea, are a part and parcel of what is called the excretory system. So let's listen in and watch a very short video, which basically shows the working of the excretory system.
Epidemic Sound provides you with restriction-free music and sound effects that you can use across all your content without having to worry
Human excretory system. In human beings, excretory system consists of a pair of kidneys, a pair of ureters, a urinary bladder, and urethra. The nitrogenous end product in man is urea. Kidney is a bean-shaped, red-colored organ. Kidneys are attached to the dorsal body wall on either side of vertebral column in the abdominal cavity. Each kidney of an adult human measures 10 to 12 centimeter in length, 5 to 7 centimeter in width, 2 to 3 centimeters in thickness, with an average weight of 120 to 170 grams. Its outer margin is convex and inner margin is concave. The notch present on the inner margin is concave. The notch present on the inner margin is called hilus. Renal artery, which brings blood to the kidney from heart, enters the kidney through hilus. Renal vein, which carries blood from the kidney to the heart, and ureter come out of the kidney through hilus. Each ureter is a thin-walled tube. The anterior end of ureter is wide and is called renal pelvis. The ureter opens into urinary bladder. Urine is stored in the bladder till it is filled and then is sent out through a canal called urethra. On top of each kidney, an adrenal gland is present. It is endocrine gland and has nothing to do with excretion. Longitudinal section of kidney. Outer region of kidney is deep red in color and is called as cortex. The inner region is light red in color and is called as medulla. In the medulla are 9 to 12 inverted pyramid-like structures with a broad base towards the cortex and narrow end towards the pelvis. These extend into pelvis. The broad end of each pyramid is branched and gives the appearance of sepals of a flower. Hence, these are called calyces. Through calyces, urine reaches funnel like ducts, and from these into pelvis. From pelvis, urine enters ureters. The cortex extends in between the medullary pyramids as renal columns, called columns of Bertini. Each kidney consists of several thousands of nephrons, which are the basic structural and functional units. They are responsible for urine formation. In human kidney, there are about 2 lakh of nephrons. Each nephron has 2 parts. 1.
That's 200,000.
Cup-like structure called Bowman's capsule, and 2. Tubular portion, figure 19.3. Bowman's capsule is a 2-layered cup with space in between the 2 layers. Inside the cup of Bowman's capsule, there is a network of large number of capillaries, which is called glomerulus. Glomerulus, along with Bowman's capsule, is called Malpighian body or renal capsule. After entering the kidney, the renal artery divides into a number of arterioles in the kidney. Each renal arteriole enters a Bowman's capsule as afferent arteriole, forms a capillary network inside the cup-like structure, and leaves the Bowman's capsule as efferent arterially. The tubular part of nephron has three parts. A. Proximal convoluted tubule. B. Distal convoluted tubule. C. Distal convoluted tubule of nephrons opens into collecting tubule. A. Proximal convoluted tubule. The tubule continues further to form a highly network called proximal convoluted tubule. A hairpin-shaped Henle's loop is the next part of the tubule, which has descending and ascending limb. B. Distal convoluted tubule. The ascending limb continues as another highly coiled tubular region called distal convoluted tubule. C. Collecting duct. The distal collecting tubule of many nephrons open into straight tube called collecting duct, many of which converge and open into renal pelvis through medullary pyramids in the calyx. The Malpighian corpuscle, proximal collecting tubule, and distal collecting tubule of the nephron are situated in the cortical region of the kidney, whereas the loop of Henle dips into the medulla. In majority of nephrons, the loop of Henle is too short and extends only very little into the medulla. Such nephrons are called cortical nephrons. In some of the nephrons, the loop of Henle is very long and runs deep into the medulla. These nephrons are called as juxtamedullary nephrons. The efferent arterially emerging from glomerulus forms a fine capillary network around the renal tubule called peritubular capillaries. A minute vessel of this network runs parallel to the Henle's loop, forming a U-shaped vasa recta. Vasa recta is absent or highly reduced in cortical nephrons.
As you can see, this particular video explains you in detail the human excretory system. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a handout that I've got, which I would suggest that you need to read through to be able to, get the details of what was being explained on the video. And that would be through reading this particular handout on the, excretory system. So this particular handout here is primarily, geared to be able to get a bit more understanding on what is being covered. There is a dissection of the kidney, which has been shown, dissection of the main organs, which are urethra and ureter, which are also shown, and then the component and the breakdown of, what and where the actual exchange of waste material happens and how it is excreted from the body is essentially shown. So I would suggest that this handout in conjunction with the video that I've shown needs to be read through in detail. Again, this would mean that you'll have to spend 2.5 hours because there are a lot of medical terms that you need to be aware of, and these would typically be useful for you to understand how the exchange of respiratory gases and also the exchange of, urine, urea excretion, or, essentially waste material is excreted from the, system. When we talk about phlebotomy, the blood tests that we are required to do at some point in time as a nurse, this part of the system would be quite useful because this will help you understand when we take bloods, we are looking at basically, going through and understanding the main components of how blood is tested to basically, determine what is wrong with which part of the human body, and obviously, what systems are not running as far as, the organs are concerned. So when we in general talk about, these in particular, what I would suggest is that you would need to be aware of some of these, because they will help you understand these systems in a bit more detail. And I would suggest that it is important because at some stage you would need to understand, these systems, because they are related to what we are looking at,
All right, we need an app from Quillbot that really shows off its
human body with regards to, the exchange or the release of waste material, which tends to happen primarily, within, with the use of these systems in particular. Now, the last system that we want to look at is the endocrine system. And what I would want to do is basically take you through this bit now, and that would be, helping you understand one of the last system that we need to look at studying, and that is where we will primarily be looking at, stopping our session after covering this particular system. So when we look at the endocrine system in particular, the endocrine system we have to look at from 2 points. We have to look at the male endocrine system, and we have to look at the female endocrine system, because there are different components when we discuss in a bit more detail, in males and in females. So if I look at presenting this maybe in a way wherein this becomes a bit more visible, just give me 1 second. Yeah. So now you'd be able to see that when we talk about the endocrine system, this system basically looks at, working in conjunction with some of the other systems in the body. And this system primarily is responsible for the hormonal balance in our bodies. So when we talk about hormones and the secretion of hormones, which are important for us, this system would, essentially be comprising of, dealing with organs which are responsible for, maintaining the metabolism of the body, the reproduction in our bodies, the growth and development. And when we face situations of flight and fear, or when we are in an accident, or when we face injuries, and then when we look at our mood swings, this part of the system, which basically looks at, dealing with let's say these kind of, outcomes. When we look at mood swings, we look at stress, we look at fight and fear, we look at, injuries, we look at metabolism of the body. Then what we are essentially talking about is the endocrine system. So the endocrine system in general is a network of glands and organs that produce, store, and secrete hormones. That is the main part that we need to understand. They basically secrete, produce, and circulate hormones within the body. Now, hormones are essentially what are called chemical messengers, and these chemical messengers basically travel through the bloodstream and regulate the functions of many of our body parts and systems. Now, they are also going to be related to homeostasis when we study, but the main components, the reason that we need to also look at endocrine system is that this particular system in our body and the hormones or the chemicals it produces actually regulates and controls the growth, development, metabolism, and reproduction of our bodies. So it is a very, very important system. And obviously, when we study this, there is a male endocrine system and there is a female endocrine system, because some of the organs and the body parts which make up this system are different in males and in females. Now, the main components of these systems typically include the hypothalamus, which is within the brain and on the back of your brain, the pituitary gland. We look at this also is sometimes called the master gland. So these are same in both males and females. Then there is a pineal gland, which is a gland which produces melatonin, which basically looks at regulating your sleep patterns as a body. We look at the thyroid gland, which is also similar. Then we look at the thymus, which is primarily, a gland which plays a major role. I don't know how many of you have heard about thymus, but it plays a major role in maintaining your immune system. And it produces the important T cells which are required, to fight, say, infections and pathogens which enter the body. Then we have the adrenal glands, which are small cup-shaped glands which sit on top of the kidneys. And these glands produce hormones, which are different in males and different in females. And these hormones which are produced actually help you, fight responses or, plan for responses against fight, flight, stress, your mood swings. And in most cases, if I remember correctly, these glands produce what is called the aldosterone, and the which is basically a chemical which controls the blood pressure in your body. So these are similar. Where it becomes different, pancreas is also a part and parcel of the endocrine system, because this gland produces both digestive juices and also has hormonal functions. That is why sometimes you would see pancreas being classified or taken into as one of the main organs in the digestive system, but it also is included in the endocrine system. It also, because of the fact that it produces hormones as well, which help in the regulation of your, let's say, the body functions. So pancreas produces what is called insulin and glucagon, which basically are important hormones for your blood sugar. So sometimes when you have a blood test and you'd say you're low on sugar or you're in high on sugar, typically is because of the fact that your insulin in blood or glucagon in blood is what is altering your blood sugar levels. Now, the difference in the male and female side of the organs which happens within the endocrine system typically happens when we look at males. It is the testosterone or the testicles which produce testosterone, which regulates the male reproductive system. And in females, it tends to be ovaries. And these basically produce what is called estrogen, which basically regulate the reproductive function, within females' anatomy. So endocrine system and the glands typically remain more or less the same, but the key difference tends to happen when we look at the male and female side of things. They tend to be the testicles and the ovaries, and that is what differentiates. And that is why we have to have two different diagrams or pictures to be able to look at the endocrine system within females and the endocrine system within males. Now, each gland within the endocrine system produces specific hormones. This enters the bloodstream. These hormones basically travel throughout the body. They help in maintaining some biological responses, which could be, fear of flight, fear of stress, your mood swings. When you look at, reproduction, production of sperm and, ovary, which produces the egg. These are things which basically are regulated by the production of hormones by different glands within the endocrine system. Now, we've also heard about conditions like thyroid. So, for example, diabetes. And when we look at growth disorders, that you're stunted, your height is stunted, or your height is, you are quite tall. And this is because of the overactivity and more generation of more than normal required in terms of hormonal growth, which basically enters the bloodstream, and then it basically, enhances the growth and the metabolism in the body, wherein people turn out to be quite tall. And sometimes we see people tend to be stunted in terms of their physical growth. And this is all because of the regulation or disorders which are caused by hormonal imbalances, which these glands and organs essentially produce. Now, there's a short video of it, which basically explains how the endocrine system works. And I can play that video by showcasing that across to you. And again, on the Moodle, we have what is a bit of a handout, and that handout basically is a handout on the endocrine system. And again, that would be something as a useful handout. I would suggest that you need to go through to understand some of these details of this system, and it will be useful for you to primarily study that. So on the Moodle, if I take you, there is the excretory system that we looked at, and the endocrine system handout that we've looked at, which I've added here. And then let's look at a brief video of the endocrine system to understand how this system typically works within the human body.
System is one of the two systems that are responsible for communication and integration between various body tissues, the other being the nervous system. Endocrine communication is achieved by means of chemical messengers called hormones. Hormones are produced in endocrine glands and secreted into the bloodstream to reach body tissues. A hormone can travel wherever the blood goes, but it can only affect cells that have receptors for it. These are called target cells. There are two major types of hormones: steroid hormones derived from cholesterol and are lipid soluble, and non-steroid hormones derived from peptides or amino acids and are water soluble. Lipid soluble steroid hormones can cross the cell membrane to bind to their receptors inside the cells, either in the cytoplasm or nucleus. Steroid hormone receptors are typically transcription factors. Upon forming, the hormone receptor complex binds to specific DNA sequences to regulate gene expression, and thus mediating cellular response. On the other hand, water-soluble non-steroid hormones are unable to cross the lipid membrane and therefore must bind to receptors located on the surface of the cell. The binding triggers a cascade of events that leads to production of CAMP, a second messenger that is responsible for cellular response to hormone. It does so by changing enzyme activity or ion channel permeability. Major endocrine glands include the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, pineal gland, thyroid and parathyroid glands, thymus, adrenal gland, islets of the pancreas, and testes in men or ovaries in women. The endocrine system also includes hormone-secreting cells from other organs, such as kidneys and intestines. Except for the hypothalamus and the pituitary, different endocrine glands are involved in different, more or less independent processes. For example, the pancreas produces insulin and glucagon that keep blood sugar levels in check. The parathyroid glands produce hormones that regulate calcium and phosphorus. Thyroid hormones control metabolic rates, while the ovaries and testes are involved in reproductive functions. On the other hand, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland play a more central, integrative role. The hypothalamus is also part of the brain. It secretes several hormones called neurohormones, which control the production of other hormones by the pituitary. Thus, the hypothalamus links the nervous system to the endocrine system. The pituitary is known as the master gland because it controls the functions of many other endocrine glands. A major role of the endocrine system is to maintain the body's stable internal conditions, or homeostasis, such as blood sugar levels or serum calcium levels. To do this, it utilizes negative feedback mechanisms, which work very much like a thermostat. The heater is on when the temperature is low, off when it's high. For example, when blood glucose level is high, such as after a meal, glucose induces insulin release from the pancreas. Insulin helps body cells consume glucose, clearing it from the blood. Low blood glucose can no longer act on the pancreas, which now stops releasing insulin. Another example is the regulation of thyroid hormone levels, which are induced by a pituitary hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. TSH, in turn, is under control of thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. When thyroid hormone levels are too high, they suppress the secretion of TSH and TRH, consequently inhibiting their own production. Thank you for watching.
So as you can see, this video, in conjunction with the other videos which are on the website, if you're looking at going through this in a bit more detail, then these videos are very, very useful, specifically because they cover visually and through animation the workings of each of the systems. So I've looked at doing a bit of research and then found some of these videos on YouTube which were explaining the systems in the right amount of detail along with the animation for us to be able to understand. And then what I've done is I've given some handouts which are primarily related to the, let's say the meat on the bones. That means the detailing of these videos, which help you understand some of these systems that we need to do so in the aspects of, human physiology. Now, this is where I'm going to end this session today, because what I would want to do in the next week sessions would be to discuss the learning outcome 1 assessment criteria, which is 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and then subsequently followed by, looking at going through the learning outcome 2 if we have time next week. So my suggestion to you and the homework, which I would say that you need to do, is basically go through these systems, go through these videos again, and then read the handouts up until next week, which should give you a very strong and a detailed understanding of what these systems are, why they are important for the human body, and obviously what role these systems play and functions that these systems have in the regulation of and maintaining the regulation and obviously the functioning of the human body. And then what we will do is discuss the assessment criteria related to learning outcome 1 next week. Any questions on today's session so far? Any questions on this so far?
No.
All right. So if you think of any questions and if you come up with any and you want to discuss, feel free to give me or drop me an email. I've got more reading material on these in any case. Should you need more reading material, there's plenty of it available. There are books on the human physiology, which is a 800, 900 page book, and it covers all these systems in great amount of detail. But I've looked at the indicative content, and obviously we are studying this unit at level 3. It's 6 credits. The idea there is to understand an overview of these systems and how it helps in the functioning and regulation of the body, human body in particular. We are not looking at going into details. Some of these units you would probably go into a bit more detail when you look at, entering and doing and studying your BSc nursing as a course. Now, let me ask you one quick direct question. Are you finding, these sessions useful for some of them, who have covered this earlier with Rex, and for some of you who haven't, studied this unit? Is this an optimal way of obviously looking at covering this particular practical unit? Are you finding it useful?
Yes, it is. It is useful.
All right. Okay. So thank you for that feedback. But like others, to also quickly mention whether they want a bit more detailing on it, or is it just about right in terms of detailing? Look at the references at the back of the slides towards the end of the slides, essentially, of the presentation, because these references would have links to additional videos or sites that I have obviously looked at some of the material from. And if you need to get more information and knowledge about some of these systems, in particular the 6 that we are covering, then that would be available in the plenary slide or in the references slide of the PowerPoint presentation. So until next week, take care, and thanks for joining this session today. I will see you next week, and we will continue our journey in terms of reading this particular unit, and we'll discuss the assessment criteria for the first learning outcome.